Lovers of lore, thank you for joining me for the third installment of the new Brothers War story. This one is really good, but I've got to warn you, this is the first time we're actually going back to a story that overlaps with the original Brothers War. The first two parts that we heard about Kayla, that stuff all happened after the Brothers War. But everything we're going to cover from now on happened during the Brothers War from a different perspective. So if you have not gone back and watched the original Brothers War series, you definitely want to go and do so now. Now that that's out of the way, let's dive in with this installment of the story. So this all takes place in the year 28 by Argivian reckoning. And if you don't know what that means, basically it's counted from the day of Urza's birth. So this would be 28 years after Urza was born. And we're actually starting out at Urza's orrery. But we're going to be going through the story from the perspective of Sanwell, who is a student pilot in Krug. And this all takes place on the day that Krug is attacked by Mishra. More details about that in the original Brothers War story. But we start with Sanwell as a student pilot. He is at the orrery, and artificers and students are running around all frenetically, getting constructs ready, because the city has just come under attack. Now, Sanwell is suffering from some serious nerves, and it makes perfect sense because these student pilots are teenage boys. The attack came super early, and Sanwell didn't actually have the opportunity to have breakfast. This worked to his advantage when his nerves caused him to throw up on the ground in front of himself. He was embarrassed, but not as embarrassed as he would have been. Either way, the cadet instructor Elora chewed him out in front of the other 4 student pilots who were there. They were actually today going to be promoted to full pilot, a little bit hastily, but the circumstances dictated it. And they were being given new sword pattern Avengers. They were operated by command rods. So essentially, these constructs are 15 feet tall. They wield 8-foot blades, and you control them either by using the command rod and your own movements or voice controls. It has dual options in that regard. And these Avengers are stronger, faster, more agile than previous builds, to the point where the artificers who made them brag that they are unkillable. And these Avengers in particular were prototypes. They were removing the straw and leather packaging off of it as they were standing there getting ready. Sanwell was given the first prototype called Sword 1, and he spoke into the command rod and basically put the construct through its paces. He was genuinely impressed with how flawlessly it responded to his commands. And at that point, Tanos runs up. He's out of breath. He's running around trying to get all kinds of things done. And he says, "Well done, Sanwell." And Sanwell appreciates how well the Avenger moves and mentions that to Tanos. Tanos congratulates him and the other 4 student pilots and officially promotes them to full pilot status. Now, this is exciting for them. There's the murmuring because, again, they're teenage boys, right? And on top of that, this is Urza's assistant, Tanos, who is promoting them directly and speaking with them. So Tanos explains the situation to them. The first wave of Mishra's forces have crossed the Marden. Actually, the way that Mishra takes the city is pretty cunning. So one more time, if you haven't, check out the original story. I just have to mention that. I can't get over how much this crazy city situation amazes me. Anyways, Mishra's forces have crossed the Marden. They have their dragon engines with them. These are unmanned versions. Now, at this point, the excitement that had been murmuring through the pilots, now it changes to fear. In fact, one of them almost fainted at this point. The city is being evacuated, Tanos went on to explain, and one of the kids asked, "Are we giving up the city?" And Tanos explained, "We're defending what we can hold. Your job is to mount a counterattack." And it turns out that these teenage boys were given such a staggering, monumental task. they were to take these 5 prototype Avengers and take on the Dragon engines. So they're given soldier escorts, and they're told you can activate these Avengers within visual range. Play it safe, don't get too close. Now the pilots could actually feel Thanos' fear, and that amped up their own concern and fear. And it actually prompted Sandwell to ask about his brother. He's not a fighter, and Thanos reassures him that his brother will be fine. And actually we find out in the other story that his brother does turn out fine. So Sandwell doesn't have to worry about that, thankfully. He's got enough on his plate. So they set off now. We've got basically Laura. She is leading the group of these 5 pilots. They're heading north, moving through panicky crowds because the regular citizens are losing their minds, as you would when dragon engines show up and start setting your town on fire, right? So these guys head north, and as they do so, first they just start to find trampled people lining the sides of the road. But as they progress, that's when they start to find horrific burnt soldiers and citizens. And then they go even further, reaching the edge of the city's defense where there's more of the same. However, at that edge, you have a Yoshin soldier perimeter. Now, these soldiers are enough to keep away the human phylogeny, but they're not going to stand up to anything bigger. So, luckily, they showed up just in time to the perimeter because the phylogeny were mounting an attack. And they come roaring in, desert savages with their charging crossbows and their blasting arrows into soldiers. And the Yoshins are throwing firebombs back. But ultimately, there's genuinely bad luck in the form of the Dragon engine. Because the Dragon engine that is accompanying this group of forces is the real original Dragon engine that Mishra brought back with him from Phyrexia. This isn't one of the constructs that's manned by people. This is genuinely an alive Phyrexian Dragon engine that has malice in its eyes and likes to torture things. This is a brutal situation to find yourself in as a group of teenage boys facing them down. Even if you have these prototypes, I can't get over how terrifying this would be. So Laura orders Sandwell to take 2 of the other pilots under his command. So he takes Rika and Carlo, and they head down a side street. And not a moment too soon, because pretty much right after they get into the side street, the position they were just located at is obliterated by a blast from the dragon. Its red mist breath weapon basically destroys everyone and everything in its path. So in a moment, Laura and the other 2 pilots are gone. All the other troops are gone. The Yoshins, gone. The only one who remains is a single soldier who staggers up to them and then falls to ash in front of them. And then at this point, understandably, Carlo loses it. These are teenage boys. They're elevated to this position abruptly. Sure, it's something they wanted to do, to be a pilot one day, but not forced into it in wartime. So Carlo can't handle what he's just seen. The reality of what they're dealing with breaks his mind. So he starts screaming at the top of his lungs. And the only thing that stops the scream is him raggedly breathing back in. So you have this sequence of insanely loud screaming and then ragged gasping breaths as the other 2 are trying to calm him down, but ultimately realize this isn't going to work. So they just end up gagging him and dragging him away. And while they're doing this, ash is raining all down over them. And that's the remains of their comrades. So they're dragging this screaming, sobbing Carlo away, retreating to a nearby empty plaza. Well, empty except for all the corpses. As the phylogeny overwhelm and destroy the 2 Avenger units that remained from the previous 2 pilots. They hadn't been destroyed by the dragon's breath weapon, but without pilots to man them, they were easy meat for the phylogeny troops. They would operate on a basic level, but the phylogeny just swarmed them under, and they also had specially designed pikes that had explosive heads. So what they would do is drive them into the joints of the Avengers and blow them apart. And so they end up taking out the two Avenger units that are there while the boys are panicking. What do we do? So Sandwell says, we can't fight it. We have to run. There's nothing we can do. And Rika says, where are we going to run to? And at this point, the conversation is interrupted by the dragon engine letting out a massive roar. And it's so powerful that the boys have to slap their hands over their ears, stop talking. Their vision is going blurry and vibrating. It's the most intense moment, and then it passes, and they can continue their conversation. Do we go to Hench, the caravan town? Do we head out to the coast and try and catch a ship? Now, the conversation is interrupted a second time, but this time it's a contingent of philology. Now, Carlo, he's useless. He's essentially catatonic, just screaming and sobbing. And that means Sword 3, his Avenger, is down for the count. That left Sword 1 and Sword 2 under the control of Sandwell and Rika to fight against the philology hordes. Now, at first, the philology are just getting mowed down, chopped into nothingness. But then one of them manages to blow the arm off of Sword 2, while at the same time knocking it down to the ground. And with only Sword 1 in front of them, the philology are able to swarm around it like ants, and they climb all over Sword 2. And of course, the philology are being taken down, but at the same time, there's so many of them that it doesn't matter. So they end up basically destroying Sword 2. The pikes explode, and this time when they do, it also detonates the power stone that's inside of Sword 2. And there's this massive wave of light and explosion, and everybody is thrown around like rag dolls. And above it all, it's punctuated by another triumphant roar of the malicious dragon engine. Sandwell fared the best of the three. He staggered up to his feet pretty much okay. Rika's face was burnt, but Carlo got the worst of it. Poor Carlo was a mangled wreck. His body was a mass of flesh and melted metal. He couldn't pull himself upright, so he's dragging himself forward, crying for help and talking about how he can't see his friends through the ash that's drifting down, and the ash is the remainder of his comrades. This is absolutely horrific, and it gets worse as Carlo's piteous cries cut off as crossbow bolts from nearby philology slam into his body. This is too much for Sandwell, so he issues a one-word command to Sword 1, kill. And then he drops the command rod because he knows that Sword 1 has already taken so much damage from the previous detonation that it barely has any time left in it. And at that point, both terrified boys run off into the ash. That ends that brutal part of the story, but there is an additional add-on just like we saw yesterday. This time, it focuses around a philology by the name of Ayman. Now, he is a very unfortunate fellow. He was basically pressed into military service, doesn't want to be here, and has been filled with arrows. And by filled, I mean he has one jammed straight through his arm. One would be straight through his torso as well if it wasn't for a lucky careen off of his armor. But unluckily, one other arrow lodged in his face, messing up his eye. So he's just laying there, waiting for death to come. And while he's waiting, he's listening to all these people around him. Their lives are ending. They're crying out to their mothers and uncaring gods as they fade away from this world. And Ayman's so weak that he can't even move away from people who are whispering death pleas in his ear. He figures he's absolutely done for. And then he becomes certain when death appears before him. But his fear turns to elation when death says, "It's too early. We have decades at least." And then death disappears. And Ayman takes that as a sign that he is meant to live. And live he does. The only sign of the battle that is left on him is his one missing eye. And Ayman One Eye becomes sure that death means for him to do better things in his life. And this is yet another time where Teferi, going back in time, has messed with people and created at least a little bit of pseudo-mythology for them. So I'm interested to see how much is going to happen when we get to the full-on time meddling that is bound to occur in the next parts of the story. So thanks for coming by. I really enjoyed this installment of the story. This is getting quite good. I can't wait to see what's next. So come on back. If you love what we're doing here, support the channel on Patreon or by joining the channel membership. In the meantime, go and enjoy some more lore. I'll see you next time. And remember, my friends, lore is life.